I'd like to introduce Anna Keating to you. Anna Keating is the co-author of the Catholic Catalog, a field guide to the daily acts that make up a Catholic life. She's the chaplain at Colorado College. Her essays have appeared in U.S. Catholic, First Things, Salon, America, Dappled Things, the Notre Dame Magazine, Commonweal, Sojourners, and more. She graduated from the University of Notre Dame and co-owns and lives above Keating Woodworks, a handmade studio. She likes to take bike rides with her husband and 3 kids. Anna joins us today to address suicide in America, physician-assisted suicide, and whole life alternatives. I ask you to give your best attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an inspiring moment. I think I've found my people in this room, so it's very nice to be here with all of you. I'm going to be speaking about suicide and physician-assisted suicide, but stay with me because at the end there's some hope and solutions. We are in the midst of an existential crisis or cultural sickness, also known as an opioid epidemic. As we know, increasing numbers of Americans are self-medicating with the hardest of hard drugs, prescription pain meds like fentanyl, which is 100 times more potent than morphine and many times more potent than heroin. More than 63,000 of our fellow citizens died last year from an overdose. More than 1 million OD'd and lived. We have more opioid addicts in the US than anywhere else in the world, despite the fact that opioids are widely available in many other countries without a prescription, over the counter. The problem is so severe that it has reduced life expectancy in the US several years in a row. Happy people, people whose mental, physical, and spiritual needs are being met, do not abuse prescription pain meds. These are deaths of despair or slow motion suicides. Parallel, but not as frequently discussed, is the public health crisis of direct suicide. 45,000 Americans took their own lives last year, and 1.3 million made a non-fatal attempt. The suicide rate has increased 30% over the last decade, and like the overdose rate, is particularly high among white Americans without a college degree. This group in particular is suffering from rising inequality and weakened social ties. Americans, as we know, are more individualistic on the left and the right, more libertarian, I can do whatever I want, and more disconnected than ever before from community, from marriage, organized religion, extended family, meaningful employment, being a member of a trade union or association. So these suicides too are deaths of despair. We know that loneliness plays a role. 1 in 3 Americans over 45 now identifies as chronically lonely, up from 1 in 5 a decade ago. And young people, despite being connected by technology 24/7, report the highest incidence of both loneliness and suicide, such that suicide is now the 2nd leading cause of death for young people, 15 to 34. I am a college chaplain, and unfortunately at my college we have had 2 students complete a suicide in the last 2 years. Still, suicide is widely considered to be tragic and suicide prevention to be a top public health priority because our social contract depends on at least this baseline agreement that we look out for one another. Americans consider the suicide of physically healthy and successful people suffering from depression or despair, like Anthony Bourdain or Kate Spade, to be tragic, heartbreaking, alarming, preventable. When People magazine did a cover story on Bourdain and Spade just this summer, it published the National Suicide Prevention Hotline on its cover, and it encouraged people feeling hopeless, helpless, or isolated to call. Because there's evidence that therapy, antidepressants, regular religious observance, and hearing the stories of others who have felt the same despair but have gotten help and have recovered can save lives. Indeed, every world religion has traditionally condemned ending one's own life because it was understood as a form of violence or homicide. Even as it is now understood more compassionately as the act of an ill and suffering person, suicide is still discouraged and prohibited. So societally, we seem to agree, right, that suicide is not the solution. And the message is clear. Or is it? Because when it comes to physician-assisted suicide, many Americans now flip the script, and the majority now support physician-assisted suicide for terminally ill people. So let's talk about physician-assisted suicide. We often think that people who contemplate suicide are suffering from severe, chronic mental illness, and many are. But taking one's own life or considering it can also be triggered by any group of adverse life events or psychosocial crises. The death of a loved one, the loss of a job, sexual assault, bullying, even or especially a devastating medical diagnosis. We know for a fact that patients in the first 3 months of dialysis are 3 times more likely to end their own lives, and that 15% of stroke victims consider suicide. We are told by its proponents that physician-assisted suicide is not about despair, and yet we know that dying often produces despair because death can be terrible. In a time, as many other speakers have mentioned, in a time of increased awareness about unconscious bias and privilege, many voters seem to want to give providers unprecedented power over life and death decisions and to make assisted suicide part of what doctors routinely do. This despite the huge power imbalance between the physician, the insurance company, and the dying patient. This is why disability rights advocates and people of color and the poor and people of faith are the most vocal opposition to physician-assisted suicide, because we understand how racism and prejudice and bias work, and we know who will be given these options first. After California legalized medical aid in dying, the doctors of Stephanie Packer, a terminally ill mother of 4, suggested switching her chemotherapy regimen to extend her life. Her insurance company refused to pay for the chemo. They would, however, cover the cost of a life-ending prescription with a copay of $1.20. Had she taken it, wouldn't this also be a death of despair? Juxtapose the People magazine cover story about Spade and Bourdain's deaths, which were described by that magazine as tragic and preventable, with the same magazine's cover story on Brittany Maynard. Maynard was 29 when she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer and given 6 months to live. She rejected palliative or hospice care and became an advocate for physician-assisted suicide and took her own life under Oregon's law in 2014. People magazine called her decision to end her life fearless, courageous, and unsurprising. In one instance, suicide is tragic. In another, a matter of course. But if there is a fundamental right to die in the face of decline or loss of autonomy being the number one reason given by patients seeking physician-assisted suicide, then shouldn't all persons be able to exercise that right to die? Mentally ill, children physically ill, able to self-administer or not? Of course. The message from the other side is inconsistent at best. At worst, it goes something like this. Do you check certain boxes? Are you poor, ill, dependent on others for your basic needs? Then suicide is a good option for you, because you no longer have value in a capitalist sense, because you are dependent. Lest we consider this line of thinking alarmist, in Western European countries like Belgium, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, where physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia are legal, the practice has increased by double digits every year for over a decade, and medical aid in dying has been extended to children, the mentally ill, people with autism, and others who simply feel they have completed life. We learn from other people how to live and how to die. The broadening of access to physician-assisted suicide has not yet happened in the U.S., where it's legal in only a handful of states. and the movement is just now gaining momentum. But a study published in the Southern Medical Journal has shown a correlation between legalizing physician-assisted suicide in Oregon and an increase in total suicides, as well as physician-assisted suicides in that state, because laws create norms. Many people who would never otherwise participate in killing do so when it is sanctioned by the government. It's difficult for me to even discuss suicide responsibly because we know that suicide itself can be contagious. We know that reporting on suicide, for example, like reporting on school shootings, murder-suicides basically, which also occur in the US more than anywhere else in the world, can have a teaching effect, particularly if the victims are celebrated and the means described. Suicide contagion is real. People who know a victim are twice as likely to develop suicidal thoughts. Twice as likely. 29 teenagers in my hometown of Colorado Springs, just down the road, took their own lives between 2013 and 2015. They all had in common knowing of another young person who had done the same. In this way, I believe physician-assisted suicide isn't simply the private choice of a patient who is ready to die. It impacts us all because it creates two classes of people, makers and takers, and it permits or encourages takers, to end their own lives lest they become a burden on makers. So when it comes to people with reduced autonomy, Americans flip the script and say suicide is a positive moral good, or what difference does it make how a person dies if they're dying anyway? In fact, physician-assisted suicide is described by its advocates as the dignified choice. Advocates for so-called death with dignity laws saying that ending one's own life on one's own terms and by one's own hand is a human right, and that suicide for suffering persons is caring, gentle, and compassionate, even though it is the state-sanctioned ending of a human life. Proponents of PAS rely on euphemism. Colorado's law, legalizing it, prohibited PAS from being listed as the cause of death, and it prohibited the keeping of detailed statistics about why people are using this law. And yet, of course, the word suicide is the only word we have in the English language for actively taking one's own life. In doctor-assisted suicide, the patient self-administers, and in euthanasia, the physician does. As Democrats, let me get a glass of water. Thank you. As Democrats, we need to question the myth of the sovereign individual who makes her choices in a vacuum. We are, all of us, the products of a society that shape who we are, how we think, and what choices we have. And what is given as an option by a person in power can often feel like an obligation, especially when there aren't good alternatives. My friend Cassie is a hospice nurse in DC where physician-assisted suicide is legal. She has never had a patient ask for medical aid in dying, but has frequently been asked by a patient's family to, quote, speed things along. Death, like birth, can be long and unpredictable. Even without nutrition, it can sometimes take weeks for a person to naturally die. Family members often feel helpless and want to do something. But I don't believe that we can kill our way out of our traumas without, at the very least, creating new ones, because killing is itself traumatic. According to the CDC, veterinarians have 4 times the suicide rate of the general population. This despite being affluent and highly educated. 1 in 6 has contemplated suicide. It turns out that euthanizing pets day after day takes a toll on providers, even though the pets feel no pain and the process is almost instantaneous. So the work of killing, even killing pets, is hard. Indeed, any kind of violence takes a toll on those whom we ask to carry it out. A Finnish study found that post-abortive women were 6 times more likely to commit suicide. even when you controlled for previous mental health issues. And according to the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, 31% of executioners suffer from PTSD. And as most of us know, 22 U.S. veterans of foreign wars take their own lives every day, and more vets have died by suicide than in the Iraq War. So it bears repeating that we cannot kill our way out of our traumas without creating new ones. So, what's the solution? What can we bring to the table as whole life Democrats, people committed to high quality universal health care, and at the same time to the idea that active killing is never health care? I have 3 modest proposals: education, legislation, and storytelling. First, education. I think we need to do for death and dying what we have done for labor and delivery, namely improve outcomes by empowering patients and their families with classes and education around end-of-life care. In birth classes, I learned about the labor process. I learned about what to expect, as well as techniques to cope with the suffering. I also learned about the medical model of birth and how to avoid unnecessary medical interventions that would prolong the process. This preparation gave me a sense of agency and dignity during a potentially traumatic experience. Only 50 years ago, most American women were drugged, totally unconscious during childbirth. They had no memory of it, and a spouse or support person, was never allowed in the room. So just as no one today would accept the twilight sleep birth experience of 50 years ago, I don't think we should have to accept the experience of death and dying in 20th century America, where octogenarians were routinely given pacemakers, when had they been better educated, many would have decided against such drastic, life-extending measures, which make it very difficult to die naturally or at home. A dead person with a pacemaker still has to have their heart turned off. And this blurs the line in people's minds between letting die and active euthanasia. And it also means that some people live longer than they would like given their quality of life. There isn't a moral duty to stay alive via technology indefinitely. Allowing oneself to age or die with limited comfort or hospice care is not the same thing as actively taking a human life. The author and activist Barbara Ehrenreich, who's now 75, has written that unless she has an urgent need, she's mostly stopped going to the doctor. She says, "As the time that remains to me shrinks, each month and day becomes too precious to spend in windowless waiting rooms and under the cold scrutiny of machines." She is a critic of the endless tests, medications, and side effects for what is essentially old age. Too many patients feel trapped in a system, they feel disempowered, and they feel that the system profits off their endless treatment. These same patients might seek physician-assisted suicide for relief from an over-medicalized life or death. Indeed, a happy death might require us being willing to die sooner of our diagnoses, but with a better quality of life. Ehrenreich writes of physicians having no code or DNR tattooed on their bodies, thus rejecting the drastic end-of-life measures they often routinely inflict on their patients. As with women in labor, dying patients are unique, and they will want different things. Some will want every intervention, others less, others none. But many of us would rather die at home than a hospital, receiving painful, costly, and ultimately ineffective care. So just as people prepare for at least 9 months for labor and delivery, so too do we need to prepare for illness and old age. We need to be educated about the differences between life-prolonging care, limited medical care, and comfort care so that we can make our wishes and plans known in living wills. Secondly, legislation. I think we need laws that affirm the dignity and value of every human being and laws that improve the way people die in America. We need laws that require providers to be trained in palliative care, laws that require nursing homes to be adequately staffed, laws that shut down nursing homes and hospices that don't meet basic standards, and of course, laws that extend Medicaid, and full coverage Medicare for all. We also need laws that require patients to be educated and informed about their rights and options, including the right to refuse treatment, and that guarantee access to psychological and spiritual support. We need to improve hospice and palliative care and make a progressive case against physician-assisted suicide, which normalizes killing and deprioritizes hospice, because there will be less of a need for high-quality hospice or comfort care once patients have a quote-unquote choice to end their lives, a choice which happens to be convenient and inexpensive for everyone else. So we need to educate patients about their options, and we need to make laws that ensure access to high-quality, nonviolent care. And finally, storytelling. I think we need to tell stories about the art of dying well. Just as women share their birth stories, we need to share stories about death and dying, because storytelling creates community and is also a form of preparation. Pushing death from our minds, hiding it away, even actively killing dying persons isn't going to make it any easier, and may in fact be making it worse. Because I think we fear most what we've never seen done well. Indeed, thinking about one's own death is proven to make people happier, strange as it might sound, because it helps them to live their lives with greater intention and sense of purpose. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. As I mentioned, we're going to take questions together once we have our next speaker.
You're a chaplain at a pretty secular place. How do the students you work with react to the kinds of points and arguments you just made, or if you haven't talked with them, how do you think they might react? Because a big part of this is trying to gain converts and get people to listen to what we have to say, and you're on the front lines of that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the students at Colorado College are progressive in a way where they're not actually politically active, but they identify as progressive more in sort of a tribal sense of like, of course I'm progressive, everyone I know is progressive, like I don't really think about it. And what's interesting to me is to see there's a lot of signs on campus around gay rights, and they'll say things like, you're for equality and tolerance and freedom, why do you still eat animals and stuff like that. It's like, you're for, fairness and kindness, why do you support factory farms? And so I think that is kind of a place where I've found a little bit of a way in, and I know you, Charlie, have talked about that in your work too, which is, here's all these people on campuses who are talking about being like green and vegan and compassionate and kind, and they have kind of this language of kindness and gentleness and tolerance of different people, but then they support abortion for the full 9 months of pregnancy pretty unthinkingly. They support physician-assisted suicide, which would disproportionately impact really vulnerable populations. So there's obviously an inconsistency there, but most of them have never really thought about it. So just kind of gently saying, that doesn't really seem to make sense. If you're worried about the treatment of chickens and cows, you should be worried about the treatment of poor Americans who feel that they don't have a choice when it comes to if they want to parent, or feel like they don't have a choice if they want to continue to live even though they have a terminal illness which requires care. So that's kind of the way that I talk to them about it, and I found them to be actually really receptive. It's faculty members in the older generation that is less receptive, and young people seem to be more receptive, I think.
Can you comment on the spectrum of messaging that people are hearing? At the one of the spectrum is faith, and at the other end is our educational system and social mores.
Yeah, I wanted to speak about faith too because I'm a chaplain and a Catholic author, but I know this is a secular venue, so I'll just speak quickly on faith and death and dying. We know that people who regularly attend religious observance, like go to church once a week, something like that, have 4 times lower the suicide rate of people who don't have any kind of religious practice. I'm a Roman Catholic, and Catholics have 6 times the lower suicide rate when they regularly attend. We found that people who go to daily, have some kind of daily observance, have almost 0 suicides. So the role of faith in public health is often ignored and stigmatized because it's kind of seen as like woo-woo magic, because we don't really know exactly how it works, but it does work, and we do need to talk about it because it is part of human flourishing, and it also is part of having a dignified death. When I pray the rosary, right, I pray for Mary to pray for me now and at the hour of my death, 50 times. That's one rosary. I pray one rosary a day. So every single time you pray the rosary, you're preparing for your own death. These kind of practices might seem sort of woo-woo in a secular context, but they actually really help and comfort people who are in crisis situations. And so why not incorporate them into the care, the whole life care for people who are in crisis?
You opened your talk with some comments on death and despair. Do you think there's a bigger, more practical value in discussing things like that, or looking at other life issues like the opioid epidemic and suicide rates?
Yeah, I'm really enheartened by I've seen a lot of articles in the New York Times and other places lately where people are having death salons and they're talking about death and they're talking about how they want to die. I think it would be amazing if we had the equivalent of what to expect when you're expecting, and prenatal yoga and Lamaze and death doulas. I mean, there's so many creative ideas about how to make this process better for people, and the beginning part is talking about it, because as we've removed dying people from our society and we've removed death from our homes, it becomes scarier and scarier. The living room used to be called the parlor, right? Because that's where you had the wake. And now it's called the living room because we do that someplace else. So we need to kind of reincorporate this, learn the way that our great-grandparents did this differently, and learn from them, kind of get some of their wisdom about how to do this in a way that gives dying persons a greater sense of choice and agency. Right now what we do is say, okay, you're in a crisis, you can end your life, but way before the point of crisis, kind of preparing. And I do think that spiritual and psychological support is a huge part of that. And not just for Christians, right? Buddhists do corpse meditation where they meditate on their own death as a form of preparation. So there is access in all these different spiritual traditions. And I think a lot of secular people would also benefit from some of these practices. You don't have to believe in God to pray or to benefit from meditation or from talking to a chaplain like myself when you're in a crisis situation. So I do think we should talk about those kind of resources as well for these people who are suffering, whether it be a crisis pregnancy or a terminal illness.
Do you think the American tendency to have a nuclear family, instead of the extended family, has added to the tendency to think about suicide?
Yes, I do. The American family is way too small. It's like a nuclear family, all alone. Everybody's working. The pressures of this capitalist system is incredibly difficult for families, and I feel that suicide feels like the only option because, okay, I'm going to die next Thursday because that's the one day my daughter can get off work to be with me. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. We're talking about a society where you can't take off paid leave. You can't take a break for even to care for your loved ones. And so, yes, it is basically a decision of utility. Nobody dreams of dying by their own hand. That's not what most people want. But we feel pressured into this situation. So I do think that, yes, it's important to talk about the need for community. And I think a lot of times we don't think about that. We think about that as, oh, I need to be around when my kids are little. But one of the decisions I've made in my own life was to move closer to my parents so that I could be around for them when they're older as well. And so we need to talk about not only caring for young people, but also caring for older people and what that's going to look like. And that might mean more people choosing to live closer to their relatives so that they can be there for them at the end of life.
All right, I want to thank these two presenters and you guys for great questions.